Alleles, what are they, Walker?
Different versions of a gene.
All right, so we have alleles, which are different versions of a gene. Number 2, Mariah.
Most organisms are diploid in terms of genetic content within the genome.
Okay, so usually we're going to see this diploid nature where we have 2 different characteristics or 2 different versions of a gene. Now, not all genes are like that. Some have multiple alleles. There are a lot of traits that have multiple genes that control it. That's called polygenic traits. For simplicity in what we look at, we're going to look at primarily just these diploid traits. And number 3, Tay?
Fertilization is the combining of parental genes in the hopes of reproducing the next generation of the species.
Okay, so in order for reproduction to take place, we have to have genes that combine from 2 different parents. Natural selection and evolution. So an important thing to note, and I told you this, guys, the other day, is that populations evolve and not individuals. An individual may have a mutation or a change or something happen, but that is not evolving. Those traits have to be able to be passed on to your offspring. If you have some mutation and it causes you to grow a 3rd arm, well, if that happens during your lifetime, which would seem odd, but if that happens during your lifetime and it's not on your genetic code that's in your sperm or egg, then that's not going to be passed to your offspring. So it has to be on the DNA of the sperm and eggs in order to be passed on, and in order for it to be passed on throughout a population. And so population, when we're looking at evolution, we're going to be assigning numerical values. So we're going to do some math here in a little bit, and we're going to look at like what it actually means for a population to change over time. Okay? So skip down to part B. Individuals suffer or benefit as the result of traits they inherit or mutations they acquire. So really, mutations could either be good, bad, or neither, right? Sometimes mutations don't do anything. We said a lot of the codons have multiple, or a lot of the amino acids have multiple codes or codons, and so sometimes it doesn't hurt, sometimes it does, and then in I think probably the rare instances we see beneficial traits that give rise. All right, population genetics. So this is looking at the genetics of the population. Remember, when we define evolution, a really good detailed way of doing that is saying the change in allele frequency of a population, so the change in the frequency of their alleles, how many they have, over time in response to in response to the environment. So the environment is the driving force behind those changes typically. Okay? All right, in population genetics, this is the field that studies the trait variation rates over time. So that's what we're going to be looking at and calculating today. Looking at how those allele frequency rates change. Now, when you hear this term gene pool, all that means is the different genes within a population, okay? And so those genes don't necessarily stay the same. There's a lot of changes over time, depending on who has babies, how many babies they have, any particular traits that are passed on. So, species, how do we define those? Matthew, part A.
Mostly defined as organisms that are so genetically similar in the genome that there exists the potential to breed and produce viable, living, fertile, able to reproduce eventually themselves offspring.
All right, so when we define a species, we're talking about a population that's living in a specific area, and those individuals can interbreed and they can produce fertile offspring. What are some individuals that can produce offspring that aren't fertile? A horse and a donkey can produce a mule. A mule is called a sterile hybrid, meaning you've crossed something, you've produced something, but it's unable to have offspring. You see a similar thing happen with lions and tigers. You can produce ligers or tigons, but typically those are also sterile. Do you know that, Katie?
I never heard of tiger.
Get your life together. So, one's with the mom of one and the dad of the other. I can't remember. Well, ligers are the ones you usually hear of just because we used to do this trip where we went up to this tiger place in northeast Alabama, and they have some ligers, and the ligers will get up to like 1,000 pounds. They're huge. And there's something in their genetic code based on, I think it's their mother, that just lets them basically just keep growing. It's interesting. Anyway, can't remember the details though. I'll have to look that up. Let's see. Genetics, part B, Nathan.
Population genetics
Mm-hmm.
is basically following allele frequency rates and gene pool, aka a population.
No, under species.
Genetics are very similar. Genetics are very similar. It's important to defining a species since it is the blueprint for constructing an organism. The plans must be very similar, or there will be confusion in construction and problems arise during development. Problems are a terrible thing to encounter since we are discussing the making of a living organism.
Yeah, so we don't want inbreeding where you're too closely related, but you have to have a lot of similarities in place in order to have those viable offspring. So, you got to have a lot in common in order to interbreed and pass on your traits. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. All right, let's see. Part C, geographic range versus population. I'm going to kind of just go through this. A population is just a given area where organisms are found usually. Now you could define, they talk about human populations, how we like have a population here in town, and we could do the United States or the world. Population is really relative to the where you're looking. I would say you typically look at a population, though, where organisms are interacting and reproducing. So maybe you have a forest where gray squirrels are interbreeding and they're around one another. That's usually how you would define a population, okay? The next part, gene pool. The gene pool, like we said, is just all the genetic diversity within a population. And then the last part there on geographic range is allele frequency. So that means the percentage of alleles that are present within a particular population. Okay? So, and that's what we're going to be looking at and calculating today. Now, a couple things we need to talk about before we go forward. Genetic equilibrium. If you hear the term genetic equilibrium, what does that mean? What does equilibrium mean? Balance. Yeah, so basically staying the same. So genetic equilibrium means your genetics within your population is staying the same, which means there's no what? No evolution. Good. So if you are in genetic equilibrium, that means there's no evolution taking place. The population's genetics are not changing. There's no change in the allele frequency. So those are a couple important terms to make sure you know. Genetic equilibrium equals no evolution. Now, I want to go ahead and talk about what has to happen in order for a population to be in genetic equilibrium. So let's go ahead and skip over to the back side here of the notes. And let's read through these 5 things that are required for a population to remain in genetic equilibrium. Okay? So, number 1. Mariah.
Large population must exist.
Yeah, in order for a population to stay the same genetically, you've got to have a large population. Otherwise, the smaller it is, the more likely, a lightning strike here or there is likely to throw off your equilibrium or mixture of individuals and their traits. Number 2, Katie.
No migration in or out of this population is occurring at that time.
Okay, so if you want your population to stay the same, no migration in, no immigration out, got to stay the same. We kind of see this in Japan where they have very limited immigration policy to maintain like the culture they have. And so we talked about population declining in apes quite a bit. And so that's one reason for that is they're trying to maintain a specific, population and characteristics and culture and whatnot. All right, number 3, Mason.
No mutations are occurring within the gene.
If you want a population to genetically stay the same, you can't have mutations. That's pretty obvious, right? And then number 4, Miranda.
Random mating is occurring. No preferences are being displayed for one trait over another trait. Everyone is equal in fitness.
Like if you had a bunch of birds and all the females wanted to mate with the one prettiest one, then you're not going to maintain genetic equilibrium because they're all going to get the DNA from this one individual instead of kind of just a shared random mating, and then that's going to change what the offspring look like. So random mating is required for that as well. And then number 5, Ashlyn.
No natural selection is occurring on the population at this time.
Okay, so nature isn't favoring one group over the other, one characteristic over another, and so it's not basically reducing weak or bad traits in the group. Okay, so all that being said, those are things that are required in order for a population to be in genetic equilibrium. Now, let's go through the Hardy-Weinberg Theorem and let's talk about how populations can change and the equations that go along with that.